My name is Evan Harvey. I'm the head of global sustainability for Nasdaq, and I'll be acting as the moderator today.
I'm president and CEO of the National Association of Corporate Directors. I've been with NACD now 20 years. I've got about 30 plus years in the corporate governance world in a variety of different positions, but it's great to be with you.
Next, I'm going to turn to Mark Hershey from Armstrong World.
Thanks, Evan. Mark Hershey from Armstrong. Armstrong is a publicly traded building products manufacturer. We're headquartered in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. So I run legal affairs for the company, also have responsibility for sustainability and business development as well. So I've been in-house for almost 20 years doing this and working closely with boards on governance matters.
Thanks, Mark. I'm here now to David Hackett, who's a partner with Baker McKenzie and longtime legal consultant for us on the UN Global Compact. So he has a lot of history with the legal implications of sustainability and sustainability disclosure. David?
Thanks, Evan. As Evan mentioned, I'm a partner with Baker McKenzie, where I advise senior management, legal departments, and boards of companies and nonprofits about compliance, risk, and ESG programs. As Evan mentioned, I've been lucky to work with him and the board of the U.S. network of UNGC for a number of years. I also have the privilege of serving as the board chair of WBCSD North America and also advise the Prince of Wales Charitable Foundation entity accounting for sustainability. And we'll talk a little bit today about some risks and opportunities related to ESG. Good to be here. Thanks.
Pleasure to have you, David. And then last but not least, my Nasdaq colleague, Kellie Huennekens, who it's been great to work with for the last few years at Nasdaq on board engagement and ESG research. She's an absolute expert in analyzing proxy seasons and looking at the results across the board for ESG transparency and ascendancy. And then, you know, Kellie also has a lot of experience, years of experience with EY, so engaging from a sort of accountancy point of view. Kellie?
Thank you. I should start off by saying it's a huge privilege to work with this panel and also work with Evan Harvey. As you might guess, we live in interesting times, and it's also great fun as well. And it's just a privilege to be covering ESG in this time and age. A little more on my background. I've been covering corporate practices for the Russell 3000 and beyond, as well as investor expectations, and seeing how those may shift in regards to the boards and the ecosystem of executives who support them, and the table of institutional investors from the stewardship teams and sustainable investment teams. Thanks again.
Thanks a lot for joining us, Kellie. And I'm pleased to report the early results from the poll indicate a 75% sentiment of familiarity with ESG practices and reporting norms. So we can pitch our discussion at a certain level here. For those of you who are in the 25%, you know, feel free to reach out to us later. And I want to go right back to you, Kellie, for the first question. And we have an outline here, but feel free to ask a question in chat or ask for more information or detail as we go along. So I want to talk about how it's supposed to run. Let's take the last 6 or 9 months out of it. Let's talk about how organizations are typically impacted by ESG issues. And are those different verticals, environment, social, and governance, treated the same within companies generally, or are they isolated and treated independently? So we'll start with Kellie on that one.
You know, if you asked me that a year ago, a few months ago, my response would have been different, but it would have changed in the middle of the pandemic. And I would say I'm back to where my original response would be, which is they all are, all parts of their organization, because ESG considerations are increasingly integrated with the traditional work of the board. If I may, let me sketch out a quick then versus now. Historically, post Sarbanes-Oxley, you saw the focus being on governance. You've got the audit committee focusing on financial reporting, the nominating committee on board candidate selection, so forth, so on. And in that framework, historically, one might describe attention to E&S issues as being more in the form of charitable contributions, volunteer work, maybe recycling. And again, this is in a very, very corporate context, a very traditional context. In short, it's been separate from business strategy and risk. What we've seen in terms of an evolutionary process over the years, but particularly accelerated recently, is that best practice today is essentially increasingly, if not essentially, synonymous with ESG. which also might be considered the same as long-termism, corporate purpose, and stakeholder capitalism, and so on. We're seeing at the same time investment dollars move towards ESG on a thematic basis, but it's both an investment conception as well as a governance perspective. Let me pause there in terms of high-level table setting of where we are and how things have evolved and converged, frankly.
And I want to turn from the general to the specific to ask Mark about how things typically work at Armstrong, or in his experience. He's been in the corporate space for a long time. So either from the compliance aspect of your position or the general counsel aspect of your position, how is Armstrong typically impacted by ESG issues? Is it in the mainstream of those sort of business strategic decision making? Is it something separate? And do you have a similar vertical for E, S, and G, or are they divided up between different experts at the company?
Thanks, Evan. So I agree with Kellie, and the evolution that Kellie was just talking about is exactly what we've experienced. I think, like a lot of companies, we got pretty good at G, or at least we thought we got pretty good at G over the years, kept it siloed. The board, management were both very clear on what G looks like and what's expected of us. And the E and S pieces kind of operated functionally inside different management groups. Over the last couple of years, particularly as we've put a new emphasis on it, that's all converged. That's all coming together, common governance structure, tone at the top. And I think it makes a lot of sense. It's all of the E and the S and the G give you an identity at a corporate level, at a strategic level. And it makes a lot of sense. It's very logical to people that they are linked that way. That's our experience.
Our experience too. It's definitely been a stakeholder engagement process for us, engaging with different audiences who might have different concerns. And the crossing of the streams across ESG tends to only happen when we're doing reporting or when we're trying to sort of blend these metrics into a unified narrative. So I want to turn a little bit now to the board and Peter and ask about, go back and then let's look at the more recent past. So that's sort of how it works in organizations previously. How has the pandemic or the social justice crisis upended board practice in your opinion? Do you have an early opinion on what's changed in the last 9 months and what will change going forward based on what we've been through?
Oh yeah, and thanks, Evan. I think the pandemic, the instance of social justice that raised everyone's awareness across the country over the past several months really have kind of shifted the boardroom focus to the S in the ES and G. We've heard numerous discussions, and it seemed to be the rallying cry among the director community that, you know, employee health and safety has got to be paramount right now. And that's, I think, a dramatic shift. Not that employees weren't always important, but I think putting them up there at that level and it's pushed to the forefront, kind of the focus. And in industries that we typically didn't see it from either. So, you know, think about retail and professional services, that still became the focal point of, you know, employee safety and health is critical. We actually conducted a survey mid-pandemic among our members, and 46% of the respondents said that ensuring the ongoing health and safety of employees is an area that will have the most significant long-term impact. And that was higher than both risk management and strategy oversight. So it just gives you an idea of how far things shifted given the environment that we're operating in. And, you know, that really makes a lot of sense when it all boils down to it, given a pandemic. You know, you gotta put your employee assets at the top of the heap, so to speak. I think the social injustice awareness that we've all been going through over the course of the last several months has also kind of focused us in on diversity as an imperative for success. And I think that's been increasing as well. Almost 93% of directors report that the primary value they see in board diversity is a broader perspective and expertise that it fosters, and that comes out of the private company side. And then we've also seen about 69% see value increasing diversity on their board. So, you know, we're really honed in, to me, on the people issues given the pandemic and the environment that we're operating in right now.
Board diversity was a pressing issue before all this took center stage. Do you feel like the gender is sort of the natural place of the pressure where this pressure will play out in terms of board practice, diversifying boards, bringing more diverse voices into the process, or is that just one aspect of how boards might shift in response?
I think it's just one aspect. I think the diversity as a whole is really going to be looked at. You're going to be looking at both racial, ethnic, and gender, age, experience. I think diversity as a whole is really going to be front and center as we move forward, because we're operating in a different environment than we ever have before. And just the fact that we're on this screen with 5 of us right now. A year ago, we would have been sitting in Nasdaq conference room, around a table. And that just lends itself to the different environment that we're now operating in as every company.
Yeah, and Tara mentions in the chat disability. I mean, when we say diversity, I think we're all using it as a shorthand for diversity writ large, not just gender, although gender tends to have stolen some of the spotlight in the last few years. There are many other aspects of diversity that we're all concerned with. So Kellie, I want to go back to you a little bit here for some of your opinions on what's changed over the last 6 to 9 months. In your opinion, based on the surveys that you've seen and the disclosures you've seen and the board practice and the proxy season materials, what's changed over the last 6 to 9 months? What's likely to change as we go forward in the next year or two in terms of ESG in particular?
In some ways, things have changed dramatically, and in other ways, they really, really have not. It goes back down to the fundamentals. So on one hand, for example, you talk about diversity and inclusion, however defined for diversity, but the emphasis being on inclusion. Fundamentally, it comes down to all people want to know that they're paid the same amount for the same kind of work. They want to know that have an equal opportunity to advance through the executive ranks and an equal opportunity also to join the boardrooms. So it's interesting to see how things have changed, and in some ways they haven't. To your question about whether the pandemic or the social justice movement has upended board practices or existing ESG processes, if for those companies who've been tracking developments in governance and ESG in that landscape, those companies will have seen that there's been an ongoing shift in terms of investor attention to diversity and inclusion and human capital. And these are groups that have been pushing for a broad range of diversity across the literal and figurative board, but also looking more closely at what's going on with the workforce and the executive ranks. It's easy to have diversity across the broader workforce. It all averages out, but is it still there when you're talking about the pipeline? Other companies didn't quite follow this, and this difference became much more evident this year. We're seeing the companies that had the boards, with the boards and the companies that had the robust processes in place, they were better positioned to pivot. They had a stronger foundation that enabled them to more readily, more quickly think more creatively about how to care for their workers, whether in terms of providing for more PPE or providing more flexible sick leave, family care policies, things like that. The ability to work from home, to Peter's point, this just happened overnight. And who knew this could happen just a year or two ago? Then on the other end of the spectrum, these developments from 2020, they've really laid bare the companies who say people are our most important asset, and where that's essentially, that comes across as spin, especially now. We're in a period where the audience knows that the company investor engagement season has started. So these conversations are happening between boards and C-suite executives, as well as their institutional investors, whether they're really large asset managers or really small asset owners. They're asking about what the company has been doing in terms of protecting their workforce more broadly, but also in particular the essential workers who are, you could say, are on the front lines of the economic and healthcare battles that we're experiencing right now.
Yeah, and do you find that, already in terms of investor engagement, ESG was a growing part of the conversation. Do you feel like the crises that we've been through over the last half year or more are only going to make ESG more a dominant part of that engagement and conversation, or are we still trying to figure out what percentage of the energy and attention should be given to this as an investor engagement tool, and what percentage is the traditional P&L and numbers?
It really is integrated. So to my earlier point about the traditional primary focus of attention of the three key board committees, right? Audit, compensation, nominating. Now we're looking at, audit. The charge is much more differentiated and dynamic. The audit committees are grappling with a more expansive and non-traditional view of what is risk and how do you report on this. Same thing for nominating committee. Wow, they've never had so much focus of attention, and they're creating their own specific nominating committee reports and the proxy statements to talk about what they're doing in terms of the candidate selection process, assessments, and training that enables the company to pivot to the current age challenges. Whatever, if you disruption in forms of technology or the environmental challenges, it's all interwoven these days. It really is. And then the compensation committee. I know we can talk about committees more later, but that has done a 180 in terms of what the expected role and responsibilities are of the compensation committee members.
All right, I want to turn to David now and go into the general counsel's realm a little bit here. I want to ask you to just sort of set the stage for us in terms of the implications of disclosing or not disclosing ESG for companies. For a long time, the predilection was towards not disclosure, not putting anything out there because it introduced potentially more risk or more perceived liability. Things seem to have changed, and you've written about this recently for Baker. So I just wonder if you can give us the landscape as you see it in terms of the pro and con of ESG disclosure.
Sure. Thanks, Evan. I mean, that question is becoming increasingly significant, really related both to reporting and in effect for the totality of the entire program. On the one hand, as Kellie was just commenting on and you were mentioning, you have significantly increased market, customer, investor, shareholder demand, all clamoring for more information, and you forego providing that information increasingly at your peril. You can lose opportunities due to your competitive inability to provide information demanded by the market. On the other hand, expanded reporting has material and significantly increasing resource management and cost implications, as well as some legal risks. As you mentioned, we published an article last month, ELI published it, we surveyed ESG litigation in the United States. And there was a lot more of it than I think than people have realized. And it's focused heavily on increasing litigation, alleging misstatements and misrepresentations across a variety of theories, from consumer fraud to securities. And importantly, there's a shift now that those cases are looking at not just what you're saying in your 10K or your ESG report, but the totality of your public statements. What are you saying in your other voluntary reports? What are press releases saying? What advertisements? What is the totality of what you were saying publicly about your ESG performance? And that's underscored both the cost and the risk and the opportunity in the area, and in particular emphasized the imperative to ensure what you're saying is true, no matter what part of the enterprise it's coming from. And those trade-offs and risk, I mean, we've seen a noticeable increase in the last two years in particular in the engagement by finance, legal, and boards to look at really the efficacy of standards and controls, and really the overall program to make sure the company is arriving at the appropriate balance to the question you're posing. And we see in general, people are kind of asking about looking at three things, increasingly including the board. One, why are we doing this? What's the business purpose, and which stakeholders are important that are causing us to drive in this area? Second, what are we, armed with the why, what are we doing? Which issues, which standards, which frameworks are we picking? And increasingly use of risk assessments to kind of answer that question. And then third, importantly, how are we going about doing it? What's the structure, the governance, the process, the controls, the oversight? What is our system and who's involved? And all that's pointing towards trying to achieve the right balance and ensuring for accuracy of what's said and answering the very difficult question that you raised. I think all this is going to be underscored even that much more in the Biden administration, in which it's foreseeable, I think, early on that there'll be proposals made to expand significantly SEC mandated ESG reporting and disclosure, which will only kind of intensify the discussion we're having now.
Yeah, those articles have already started to appear about those day one initiatives, and not just reversing policies of the last 4 years, but leveraging the SEC in the name of investor protection and other things in order to provoke more ESG disclosure and standardization and engagement. So I'm seeing the same thing. Peter, I want to go back to board practice a little bit. We just heard how there's an evolving attitude in the general counsel's office about ESG and the fragmented format of disclosure and the lack of standardization, and basically a more enlightened attitude about from the legal side to take this issue on and to consider it as a strategic imperative, if not or part of the company. So I want to ask about board practice. I know that there have been some committee name changes and there have been some advances in terms of briefing the board about ESG, but to what extent today would you think that U.S. boards have dominion over ESG within the company? Is it a nice to have, they'll do some oversight here or there, or are they getting more intimately involved with the strategic implications of ESG?
Well, I think you framed that exactly right, Evan. It really depends. Every company's a little bit differently, but how they've incorporated ESG into strategy is kind of the keystone in terms of where we see the implications of oversight and the aggressiveness of the oversight. It's kind of, I liken it to the environment that we had about cybersecurity, 5-7 years ago, where it was a new discussion or a new element of the discussion. And as you integrate it more into strategy, obviously those companies that have put this front and center in their strategy, they're going to have very effective oversight, and it's going to be an agenda item on a regular basis. The discussion is going to be pretty thorough. Those on the opposite end of the spectrum, where it's more considered more of a philanthropic activity, you're not going to see a lot of oversight. Maybe it hits the agenda once every year or so. But, we're obviously encouraging companies to put it into the former and make it a part of the strategic discussions that they're having so that this is a regular activity. 80% of directors tell us that they're focused on ESG. Now, we may be surveying the informed, so to speak, the people that are already in that category of the strategic asset approach. But, I think the big challenge for boards is, while there may be interest and there may be discussion, the effectiveness of the oversight becomes a challenge. How do we effectively oversee what management's doing here and get the reporting and the information that we need out of it? And to that end, we just released a primer on ESG for boards that really hit, here are the 4 key issues or challenges that boards face with regard to ESG reporting and the potential solutions to those. So it's really a matter of the boards digging in and defining what ESG is to them and how it fits into the overall scope of what they're doing, looking at incorporating it into the strategy, as I said, so it's a regular dialogue that the board's having and it's part of the strategy discussion, moving it to more active oversight by the board itself. It's not, some boards have committees, but it's relatively rare that we see committees designated for ESG alone. It may be slotted into different committees, and then some boards take it on as a full board responsibility as well. But defining where that needs to be and making it an active issue versus a reactive issue in terms of the discussion points, and then discussing and addressing the external expectations, which is what we were just talking about in terms of the shareholders, the stakeholders. What do we need to be focused on as it relates to the different external parties that are looking at us as an organization, and what do we need to be reporting out? So, again, it varies across different companies and different maturities of companies, but I think those that are placing it into the strategic discussion are going to have much more focused oversight here.
I want to go back. I'm going to come to Kellie in a second on the question of dedicated I think it's an indicator of board acceptance and mainstreaming of some of this ESG work. But I have an impromptu question for you, Peter, and maybe Mark as a second. How are boards getting educated on ESG? How is the information necessary in order to make strategic decisions around ESG bubbling up to the board? I know NACD does training and engagement with their membership. I know there's lots of opportunities for self-learning, but I'm just curious if you have an opinion about how boards are, learning a new skill. For a long time, boards were exercising a corporate governance muscle and doing the same thing, with over time and sort of knew how to do it. This is a different way of looking at business and a different way of measuring performance. How are boards expected to integrate this into their knowledge base?
Well, because this is a relatively new, in the grand scheme of things, discussion point, there's a lot of education that has to go on. Directors tuning into webinars like this, where you're learning about what the expectations are, where boards focus on it. There is a desire to learn more, and I think that's going to be key. We offer programs around this. A host of others offer programs around this. Your management team, if you're on the board of directors, your management team can bring you a host of resources to understand who's out there. What are the ratings agencies that are looking at this? What are the key issues that are focused on? What different metrics should we be considering? And you can go by industry. You can go broad sweeping as public versus private. There's just so much information out there, but it's really availing yourself and making sure you're taking a proactive approach to it. And that's what we're encouraging boards to do.
All right, I want to come to Mark for a sort of two-parter now, based on what Peter has just said. So first of all, Mark, any disagreement with how David sets the stage in terms of ESG disclosure and the legal implications of doing too much or too little, from one colleague to another? I'm curious to get your take on what he said. So that would be number one. And then number two, responding more to what Peter was just talking about, and I want to ask you about your experience at Armstrong. How does the board, how much of the board has control or access to ESG issues, and how are they getting trained or educated? How are you getting trained or educated on that topic?
Sure. So I would call David and ask him the questions that he raised. I think it's not uncommon for general counsel to struggle. I know we have with the issues David's raising. I'll put HR into that group. David cited a bunch of functions as well. HR concerned about putting out data that traditionally has been confidential or considered more private information. There are demands for that, and we want to be transparent, and we want to. The truthfulness hasn't been the challenge. This is data we've never shared before. So in some respects, there's safety in numbers. In some respects, there would be safety in standardization or regulation around how and when and what. But no, we're very mindful of the issues David summarized, and it's a real concern. I think the benefit for a company like us over the last few years that's been reinvesting and re-engaging in this to build a new platform for ESG is there's more advice, like from David and others, around this, about how to do this. And so I'll connect that to some of Peter's comments and also go back to the earlier comments on shareholders. I think boards can take great comfort from shareholder outreach. And so as an example, right now, we're in our shareholder outreach month right now, November. And every one of those calls, and we've been doing these for years, every one of those calls with one of our top institutions has started with ESG first, and then the pandemic second. And everything else we've traditionally had on the agenda: executive conversation, last year's proxy voting results, profile of the company, that's taken a backseat. We're not even getting to those topics. And investors have been very forward in saying, oh, we like this goal very much. We'd love to hear more about that. So it's a very powerful message to bring back to a board and say, this is what we're hearing directly from our shareholders. It is absolutely a new skill. And Peter mentioned cyber. I think about cyber, I think about ERM, I think about SOX. And boards over the years were trained on these very, very risk-oriented sort of mindset, oversight, but risk-oriented. I think the big shift for us has come when we started having the conversation around strategy. We didn't put it into a risk category anymore. We put it into a value creation category. And oversight of the strategy, oversight of execution against the strategy is a very comfortable role, I believe, for a board, very natural. And when we start talking about value creation and the value drivers of a program like this, aligning it to your purpose, the dialogue tends to take off. It really does. And I think that role becomes much clearer. I'll turn it over to Kellie to talk about the committee piece, but for our part, we did do that. We did charter a committee, our board did, for that purpose.
Yeah, I want to mention to people that we have the chat on the right side of your screen, so you could ask questions in there if you want. Trying to put relevant links in there if people mention publications, and we have a couple of polls. And Kellie, we want to go back to you for not only a question about dedicated committees, what you're seeing in terms of the evidence on how many U.S. companies have a dedicated committee or how the rise of that label, but also just any other sort of ESG-related board practices that you're seeing evidence by the data that you get when you look through filings.
Thanks, Alvin. As folks know, on this, the term ESG is so incredibly broad. Perhaps one of the easiest ways to narrow things down is to use the specific example of human capital, that S component that has risen to the fore. It's something that it's intuitive, folks follow it. Everyone was an employee at some point, most were, still are, or many. So let me stop there for a second and take a step back and say, what's going on within the board committee space? It will vary dramatically. To Peter's point, it's not very common. I think it's roughly 7% of the S&P 500 or so have a dedicated sustainability committee. That said, it pretty much, as in all things with data and data quality, it depends on what you're looking for and looking at. So some might say 100 of the largest companies, along with Fortune 500 or the S&P 500, they all have a sustainability committee. It really depends on how you're defining the roles and responsibilities there. If a company has a dedicated board charter, committee oversight of a specific element, diversity and inclusion and human capital management, does that count as an ESG committee? How do you treat the environmental health and safety committees that are more traditionally and compliance oriented, not necessarily more, and I would say they're less aligned with what institutional investors these days are asking for when they ask for a sustainability committee. Because on one hand, those have the compliance requirements, and it's more of a check the box. It's not necessarily towards the long-term growth and system strategy that these stewardship teams and sustainable investment teams are pushing for. So I would share a word of caution with regards to how that data is evaluated. I would say that, along the lines of that integration concept, let's look at the compensation committee. That's a pretty good, again, going back to the S focus, employees, compensation is a great area to just focus attention on. We've been seeing over the years more and more boards extend their focus from the CEO and the C-suite to 1 or 2 ranks down, 3 or 4. More and more we're seeing the extended attention to the broader workforce. We're seeing formal codified responsibilities with regards to oversight of employees. We're seeing leadership development as a focus, and not just the pure play compensation that is associated with traditional governance topics. And I would also pull in that we're seeing more and more attention to the idea of how E&S metrics may be incorporated into compensation plans with regards to incentive structures. Companies say they are purposeful and they do X, Y, and Z. Well, how does this match with the compensation priorities, incentive structures that's laid out for the executives? So there's more of a holistic approach to ESG, and in the word integration, we're seeing more and more of that on the corporate level. I think, Evan, you asked for some numbers. I wasn't ignoring you. They're just really fuzzy. I want to say they're about roughly 30% or so of the largest companies have shifted the naming of the committee to include a people component. So it's the personnel and compensation committee or management development committee or something like that. And I think more than that, though, if you were to look at the committee charter, you're seeing more specifics and more granularity there going beyond the naming. And of course, boards are meeting constantly these days, and their workforce is a big part of that, and supply chain and the people management component of that is a huge element of what they're meeting and discussing.
Understood. Thank you. David, I want to come back to you a little bit now for sort of give us informal legal counsel here as if we were a client. How should, that's unfair, how should organizations be structured in terms of ESG decision making? Do you see this as ultimately a governance issue within companies to manage, or is it much broader than that?
Well, I think kind of as Mark was talking about before, it's become an issue that's, it is a governance issue, but it's increasingly going to kind of the core strategy and heart of what the company is about. But I mean, just to step back for a second, fundamentally, design, implementation, operation of the ESG program is the responsibility of management. And the board's responsibility is to oversee that and to ensure that it's appropriate, effective, and being implemented well. But ultimately, it's the management's responsibility to design, own, and manage the ESG performance. I mean, the issue or the challenge, which both Peter and Mark have commented on, I mean, we undertook a study with Deloitte and WBCSD similar to what Peter alluded to, which was to look at kind of requirements in multiple countries related to boards and ESG, and then interview a number of board members really around the world. And we heard the same things Peter alluded to, which are there's a high recognition on the part of particularly public company, but private company boards as well, with respect to the growing significance of ESG and its relationship to the company's prospects, short and long term. But equally, there was a pronounced discomfort on the part of lots of board members in their ability to meaningfully and effectively discharge their oversight responsibility. I mean, you'd hear a lot of people say, hey, look, we get nice reports, there's good brochures, nice presentations on a quarterly or semi-annual basis. But gee, I don't feel that I'm so knowledgeable in the area that I'm adequately well positioned to really be commenting on, are we addressing the right issues in the right way? And for sure, one of the answers, which NACD in particular, I think has been handsomely addressing, is to increase board training and understanding of ESG so that they can discharge that responsibility. So, I mean, to answer your question, look, it's the company's management's responsibility to design and implement effective programs. It's the board's responsibility to really provide guidance and assure that it's appropriate and is progressing in a way that it should. And I think we still have a ways to go on board comfort level with being adequately positioned to be as engaged with that issue as they see the increasing need to be.
Yeah, let me get Peter to chime in on that. Is that your takeaway too, that boards recognize there's a growing sense of responsibility for this subject matter, but maybe, not the same sense of a feeling of competence or total understanding in order to execute it?
Yeah, well, when you look at ESG comprehensively, it's really measuring everything across the company is what it comes down to. And, that's a tall order when you think about the talent that's within the organization. You think about the environmental issues that the company, you think about all the governance issues, there's a lot in that. So getting your arms around that and really understanding what do we need to not only focus on, but then report out about in the lack of standardization that we've seen in the industry over the last 3 years as this has evolved. We're seeing more, with SASB really kind of taking the lead here in terms of what the reporting metrics ought to be. But until we have some, concrete as this is what's going to be needed, it is a challenge. So that education component that David was just referring to is critical, as you've got to really focus in on your industry. You've got to focus in on what your peer groups are doing. you really got to focus in on your shareholders and what do they expect? What do they want? So that conversation that Mark was talking about just a minute ago of, having that dialogue, and that's where they're focused. So what do they want to hear? What reporting do they want to know? And so this is a learning exercise as this continues to evolve, and the boards just really have to stay on top of it and avail themselves to as much information as they possibly can right now.
Yeah, so I want to go to Mark a little and roll this into another question on our outline, which is the decision-making differences around ESG when there's a significant or a modest investment required. I mean, sometimes performance on ESG, especially around some of the energy initiatives and carbon neutrality, and maybe some of the benefits associated with culture and capital productivity, there could be significant investments involved. So in your experience, is there a more formal decision-making tree available in use when there's a significant investment required in order to get up to speed on ESG? Or is this just the price of doing business, and at a place like Armstrong or other places, it's recognized that this should be baked into the operating costs?
Yeah, we're getting there, but that's hard. That's been an evolution, Evan. I think naturally, historically, particularly when there wasn't a centralized function or a dedicated board oversight to it, it was difficult, and the larger decisions were just harder to get through because they didn't fit inside the context of a long-term ambition, a long-term strategy for a program. Once that got set for us, then the process for small or large became very clear. And you're looking at 10 or 20-year time horizons for some of these goals and initiatives we're undertaking, and a multi-year strategic plan where we're slotting in investments for each of the kind of goal areas for us, which we've organized in 3 different pillars of activity. And so we want to dedicate to each pillar over these long-term cycles enough capacity for investment over those periods. And so we are looking out, and it's a bit uncomfortable to try to project what you're going to need for capital over these longer term goal time horizons. But we want to be complete. We want to put enough in there so that the functions that take ownership of those goals then don't have that problem that you're raising. This is a large cap. This is a small cap. It shouldn't be. If the vision is there and the goals are there and the roadmap is clear, then we're executing, right? So up front, it's getting clarity of and alignment at the top of the organization with that vision. And then what are the building blocks to get there? Once we have those, then that size of that block or that investment that dissipates.
Yeah, and Kellie, just to come back to you for a second, some of this illustrates the tension between short-term and long-term thinking. So investors inevitably get involved in this. An investment that requires a significant amount of money over a significant amount of time needs to be baked into their investment decision. And as much as investors might want to see better ESG scores, higher ESG performance, more long-term results and outcomes, they don't often have a wealth of tolerance when it comes to investment that might shave some money off of the EPS or other things. Is that your take as well?
It depends. Yes. Answer. The longer answer is it depends on which functional group within the investor organization you're talking to. And one of the things that we're seeing, and it's still, I would say it's early stages, but it depends on who you talk to, is ESG integration, which is the greater connectivity essentially between the stewardship teams, ESG specialists, sustainable investment specialists. The closer integration between them and the portfolio managers and the product, we're going to see over the longer term more alignment. We're already seeing that, again, depending on who you talk to, alignment and consistency with regards to how an investment organization is addressing opportunities to invest, opportunities to engage, or opportunities to vote with regards to a shareholder proposal. So it's coming. It's not here yet, certainly. And that's part of the confusion in this world that we live in. It's really messy, to the point that Peter made earlier. But one of the things I wanted to focus on is to think broadly of materiality. What is it that your internal business stakeholders say are key to the business functions, either short-term or long-term? And if you're talking to your institutional investor base, would they agree? Would they disagree? And would they shade or add components to that. Not that they would know everything, but it's a way to get free consulting and to think outside of the box in terms of what folks might be missing. And it's so important these days when we're talking about the early conversation about board diversity. We're talking about ways to think out of the box to better navigate the sustained period of disruption and unexpected developments within the competitive landscape. It's something that would be helpful to just hear. So here's to more investor engagement.
So to my colleagues, we have passed the audience Q&A threshold timing. So we're going to turn to some of the questions that were in chat here in a second. But I want to, if I could, go to David and Mark for a 1-minute response on what Kellie just raised. Is the materiality lens still the dominant legal framework for ESG understanding and disclosure? I mean, that's been what the SEC has pushed U.S. companies for a long time, which has generated essentially zero disclosure when it comes to ESG. But in terms of your role as a general counsel or working with the legal departments of companies, is that still the gateway through which we have to look at whether a company should or shouldn't disclose anything? We'll start with David.
Certainly with respect to SEC reporting, people focus on appropriately the scope and meaning of materiality. But equally in the marketplace, people are using materiality to mean a lot of different things. I think what is fundamentally important is the growing interest in, along the lines of what Kellie was just mentioning and others have observed, looking at and understanding who your significant stakeholders are, what's important to them, and determining, whether that's through a risk assessment or some other evaluative process, what issues matter to us. Now, whether you want to call that materiality or not, they get people who will have side arguments about, no, that's not the SEC's definition, et cetera. It is increasingly important. And companies, by and large, are moving towards trying to sort out in a variety of ways what issues matter to them and go through processes to try and discern that. So I prefer to focus on that and not get hung up on what's the definition of materiality.
Just ask Mark for a quick reply. Does that jive with his experience? Is that the way you think of this issue too, coming from the legal background or the compliance background?
It is. It's a shift away from let's say what's material financially or what needs to be a risk factor in the company to what the SEC has always been pushing for, which is greater transparency into how the business is being managed. I think about the management discussion and analysis section of our periodic reporting. That's designed to let a shareholder and investor into what we're feeling, our confidence levels, what we're observing, what's important to us, and it's much more qualitative and open. And I think that's where we're trying to get to.
A couple of questions that have come in via chat that I'm going to sort of interpret and send out to whoever wants to take them. First, do we measure properly research and development investment in ESG? Is there a number out there that investors or other observers or decision makers can use to understand how many dollars a company has put into its sustainability or ESG efforts? I see a fragmented landscape where you might have to comb through the balance sheet in a dozen different places to find that investment, because we don't traditionally categorize things as ESG or not. We don't even traditionally categorize things as ESG or not in investor calls. Nobody stands up and says, it's time for my ESG question. So I don't know that we would do this in the balance sheet either. But does anybody think that they have there's a metric or there's somebody that's doing this well in terms of measuring investment in ESG at the company level? That's kind of what I expected.
Well, but look, I mean, there is certainly, related to some ESG characterizations and metrics in particular industries, questions and a focus on overall how much money is being spent on research and development. Now, is that ES&G or not? I don't know. I'm not sure that that's necessarily the right question. I mean, it may be more what's research and development funding, and is it adequate for what seem to be the purposes of the company and its long-term strategy?
Fair enough.
If I can add to that, and I'm taking advantage a little bit of the broad, here, but if we look at people, or look at the workforce, it's all expenses, first of all, but second of all, are we talking about training? Are we talking about PPEs? Are we talking about the cost to the company of different types of sick leave plans and family leave plans, things like that? One might argue, or how do you provide to make sure the performance evaluation processes are unbiased? What kinds of trainings do you provide, not just with regards to the broader workforce, but management and more specialized people, talent-related considerations? Because again, it's easy to hire, it's harder to groom and encourage a diverse group of executives come up through the ranks and things like that. So these are measurable, but not in the traditional way that one might consider.
So my friend Brian, not much of an answer. We share your confusion about how to measure that. Maybe you can come up with something and report back to us. One more.
I mean, Evan, you could argue that if you look at the SASB standards for the pharmaceutical industry, for example, where some of the standards go to the development of new drugs and you provide information related to R&D related to that, that's an indicator. But that's, I mean, as all of us are commenting, that's the exception, not the rule.
Well, and that's very specific and traditionally understood R&D too. I mean, it's hard to measure R&D in human capital. It's hard to measure R&D in sort of productivity and things like that. So one more question that I'm sort of, altering a little bit from the chat, which is your personal estimation on where U.S. boards and C-suites were prepared or not for the COVID crisis and the social justice crisis. Are we overstating the way that we were all gobsmacked by this and how it upended all of these practices, or were we actually prepared for some part of this based on the last 10 years and the way we've trained for other disruptive elements, like attacks and weather events? So does anybody have a point of view on that? Maybe Peter has an opinion. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the resiliency that a lot of companies have shown in the midst of this has been remarkable. I think Kellie mentioned earlier, our company, like most, made the determination that tomorrow we're going remote and everybody's going to work from home. And sometimes you're forced into those scenarios by natural disasters, et cetera. We had been thinking about it, but we were 2 weeks out from a test. And then literally the next day we said, okay, forget 2 weeks. Tomorrow, everybody goes remote and just start working. And we adapted and we're still functioning, and I think every company across the country has gone into that mode in different levels. But, I think we've been enabled via technology to think differently about work. We've been enabled to think about crises and how they may impact us. And there's not a general solution to any of these things, but I do, commend companies on the resilience with which they've acted. And I think a little bit of the foresight that it may not have been, hey, we think there's going to be a pandemic next year, but I do think, we're looking at what are the disruptors that could, imperil our company and how do we manage around those. So I do think there's been a little bit of foresight that has gone into the uncertainty and the disruptive factors that are out there and how do we manage through those things. But it's clearly not we know exactly what's going to happen and we anticipate this. We've built up different ways to address the uncertainties within the environment we're operating in.
My experience as well, our experience as well. And I'm guessing David is the only one who looks like he's in an office today. Were you just better prepared to deal with this, or you're essentially a mobile guy anyway?
I have declining confidence in my internet service at home.
All right, so let's close with the big question here. Thanks to everyone who submitted questions in chat. So I want to go around the horn and get you a quick answer to this last question that we had thought about, which is who within and we want to return to, it strikes me that we haven't really answered this question about organizational change and moving ESG projects through the pipeline. Who, in your opinion, is the best advocate for sustainable organizational change? What function or what person? What have you seen work in the past? And is that person, is that function properly empowered today to drive things forward? So let's, in the last 2 minutes here, get at sort of the heart of the question. I'll start with Kellie, just because I'm curious to know what she thinks about this.
In a word, I'd say it's the CEO. You need to have the leadership commitment at the very top to have that type of integrated approach to thinking differently about the traditional way of doing business.
Now, CEOs are generally free to opine and act on this topic, or does it depend on the organization?
The opining question I'm going to set aside, if I may, just because it's very volatile times. But we talked about this where ESG doesn't have to be labeled as ESG. It's environmental and social considerations and governance considerations to provide for a corporation that can grow for a long period of time. Fundamentally, that's what it comes down to. And that involves stakeholders, that involves, of course, compliance with the legal restrictions. And it also requires an amount of just thinking differently. What is it that your investors are looking for? What is the world that they're seeing that you're not necessarily seeing? And how do you navigate the different challenges there? What I'm seeing and what I'm hearing is that without buy-in at the top, it's very, very difficult to move significantly. I mean, you can still move, but it's very, very slow.
All right, Mark, your quick response, what do you think?
100% agree with Kellie. Yeah.
I like that. Very, very to the point. David, what do you think?
Agree completely, although it's also very helpful to have effective sustainability staff who really are champions and capable, but they cannot be effective without leadership support.
All right.
Sometimes it can be difficult to get good leadership support if you don't have good and compelling sustainability people, but
that's true.
Those two things are both important.
Peter, I'm going to give you the last word. What do you think? Who's the prime mover in the organization as far as you see it?
I have to agree. I think you have to have that tone at the top, so to speak. But I do think you need to have the buy-in from not only the functional expertise within the organization, but the board's got to be bought in too. It's one thing for the CEO to push; it's another for the board to agree and get that momentum behind and move the company forward.